The single most important message that we're trying to communicate with this symposium is just how important ocean change is for all maritime nations and their food security. Ocean acidification is probably not as well recognized a climate change related stressor in the oceans, but in combination with pollution coming from the land, potential stress from fishing, and ocean warming, together these things collide to create some serious issues for not only the marine ecosystems that we love for recreation and beauty, but for aquaculture, especially of things that have hard parts, if you will, so shells like clams and oysters and sea urchins, which you wouldn't think would be a really important animal, but the gonads inside an urchin are uni, the sushi uni. So there's some really important issues here that we're trying to communicate to a broader audience. So when we first started thinking about ocean acidification, we really had much more of a perspective about open oceans. And we were thinking that as carbon dioxide dissolves into the surface of the water from the atmosphere, just like it would in the bay right behind us and just like it is right now, that the pH of the ocean would change and the pH would become lower over time as carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere. So two things happened that adds to our new knowledge and thinking about the problem. That is, we started to get examples very recently about ocean pH related problems in shellfish aquaculture on the west coast of the US. And secondly, we got this really great new technology, these new sensors that allow us to record pH in the waters. So we get a much better idea of what an organism is experiencing in its natural environment, what natural variability is. And that tells us a little bit about how they'll be able to adapt, or will they be able to adapt. So it's been a whole new perspective. But on the other end, we've really realized that, if you will, trees are falling in the forest now, that there are places that we can identify acidification-related losses of capital in aquaculture in North America. The Omegas Project is a consortium of researchers that's funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, and we're really sort of a merry band of biologists and oceanographers who got together and wanted to start studying whether organisms were adapted to different ocean acidification or ocean acidification seascape conditions in nature. If we take one step back, when we think about what's going to happen over the next 100 years, we talk about thinking about how pH in the ocean will change given a certain admission scenario that we might predict. But we know in our heads as biologists and oceanographers that there's some natural variability out there, and we wanted to learn about whether or not Mother Nature could tell us something about the variation in nature, and whether or not organisms that make hard parts like oysters and mussels right now have the capacity to respond differently to these conditions. So what we're specifically doing is going out at locations from Central Oregon down to where I live in Santa Barbara, California, and we're deploying instruments, recording oceanographic sensors so that we can measure the pH and understand the carbonate chemistry in the water at about 8 different sites, let's say up and down the coast. And then we're doing biology right on top of those sensors. So we're asking, how does this population do in response to lower pHs? Does it make a shell? Does it grow? What's the respiration like? What are the physiological things going on in the animal? And then we do genetics so that we ask, are there genetic differences between these populations that will link to their performance, how well they do? And the answer to this is really critical, because one of the really important nuggets of hope here is that organisms do have plasticity and do have the ability to respond to changing conditions in a way that we haven't uncovered yet. So lacking a time machine, what we do is it's called kind of replacing space for time. So we go looking for gradients in the environment that tell us that there are different ocean acidification profiles in nature, and literally ask the animals, how you doing? Two of the key insights we've made during this project have related to exactly the two really separate parts of the project, what's going on in the water and what the animals are doing. And so in the water, we've learned that there is variation up and down the coast, so that we do see different patterns of pH and seawater chemistry that are driven by oceanography. And to expand on that theme, people in my group and other places around the world have deployed these pH recording instruments in coral reef environments, and we've put some out in the Antarctic. And what we've learned is that not all ecosystems are the same. Marine sites vary a lot, and therefore the animals are being exposed to really different natural variability in pH, which in some cases might help us understand what they'll be adapted to, how they'll be able to adapt in the future. And if nothing else, it helps us do a better job in designing our lab experiments. On the organismal side, thinking about the animals that make those hard shells, we've had probably like 5 to 7 years now as a community to do more research, to learn more about single species. And what we find is that some organisms are more resilient and tolerant of these natural variation properties than others. So for example, although the project's only a year old and we're still looking at the data, it seems like sea urchins are a little tougher than, let's say, oysters. And some shellfish like mussels seem to show more sensitivity, and oysters show more sensitivity to ocean acidification, ocean pH change than the sea urchins do. So this is really important from a thinking big, food security, what are we going to do perspective. In addition to working on the West Coast and other parts of the world, we're doing a lot of research in the Antarctic. And we're interested in that not so much because we're harvesting food from there, but because it's a really vulnerable ecosystem. It's one of the last untouched marine ecosystems on the planet, the Southern Ocean and parts of the Ross Sea where we work around McMurdo Station, Antarctica. And the waters there are really, really cold. They hold a lot more CO2, and therefore they start out being a little more acidic. It's harder to make a shell there, so the organisms there are already a little more vulnerable to ocean acidification in the future. So through a project funded by the Office of Polar Programs with the U.S. National Science Foundation, we've been going down there and studying important members of the marine community there that make those hard parts, like sea urchins. And we've been studying them for about 1.5 years now, and we're learning some really neat things about them, that they're a little more resilient than we thought, so that they're able to tolerate some kind of hard shell-making conditions. And we don't really understand all of it yet, but it could be it's because they're really used to it. But this is a great example of a place on the planet that's really important to the way the whole world's ocean works. The Antarctic Ocean is a really significant environment. It has a very short food chain, so fish eat a few zooplankton-y things in the water, little krill-like things, and then penguins eat the fish. And so it all hangs together in a really important way. And we think in time it will be one of the first threatened marine ecosystems in terms of thinking about ocean acidification and ocean warming.